Awesome. So thank you for joining the session or the panel on VR interaction. We have an amazing panel here that will share their personal stories about what works, what doesn't work in VR interaction. And for me, it's probably one of the most interesting things, most exciting things, because it's all up to us, the community, to reinvent a whole new language of interaction, and nothing beats that. But first, let's meet our contestants here. So to my left, CEO of nDreams, give it up for Patrick Olunok. And to his left, CEO of Rumble Entertainment, we have Greg Richardson. And then we have the co-founder of Loot Interactive. Give it up for Danilo Moura. And at the far left, VP of Games and Interactive Entertainment at Skydance Productions. Give it up for Spencer Hunt. As to myself, my name is Inbar. I'm the CEO and co-founder of AugmentedReality.org, which is a nonprofit organization to advance augmented reality. But I've been experimenting with VR since the 90s and also founded an augmented reality company in 2008. So interaction is really one of my passions as well. So now let's get to hear, to learn more about you guys here. So in 1 or 2 minutes, tell us a little bit about yourself and what gets you up in the morning when it comes to VR interaction. Patrick, we'll start with you.
So for those of you here this morning, we're a VR developer and publisher based in the UK. We're working on a load of mobile and high-end VR games. Probably most interestingly and most appropriately, a game called The Assembly, which is an adventure game with lots of storytelling, about four hours long, with 2 different characters. You switch between them as it tells you a pretty powerful roller coaster of a story set in this mysterious underground bunker. What gets me up? I fell in love with VR 2.5 years ago. So when I tried the first Oculus DK1 and Sony gave me a very early look at the Morpheus, I kind of flipped. I'd seen VR in the 1990s with the virtuality headsets and thought it was pretty cool, but the tech was never there. And seeing the DK1 for the first time and seeing what Sony were doing made me fall in love with VR completely, and so much so that we pivoted the company to focus completely on VR. So I just love VR. I'm completely sold on it, and that's what gets me up.
Thanks, Patrick. Greg?
I was just realizing the other day, I think it's been nearly 25 years I've been in the interactive entertainment business. So I've had roles as developer, as a publisher, as an investor, places like Electronic Arts, BioWare. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I got approached by an alternative reality company called Z-Space, and I started to work with them and kind of watch the progress of the technology they were building. And here in the last year, I got very intrigued, both from the lens as an investor as well as a content creator. And I spent a lot of time over the last few months meeting with entrepreneurs, getting demos, and just getting a sense of how this market is going to differ from the ones that I've seen evolve over the last couple of decades. So incredibly excited about the opportunity in front of all of you.
Danilo?
Hi, I'm Danilo Moura. I'm a co-founder of Loot Interactive, which is a team that started as part of Sony Pictures 8 years ago. And we have done a lot of cool things on the game side and also the video streaming side. Our team just finished work for hire for Twitch on the PS3 and the PS4 app, and also for Red Bull TV, which is a video streaming app running on a game console. And we also published 6 games on PlayStation so far, just on the PS4. And what drives me every day, specifically about VR, is the 2 projects that I have been working for the past 7 to 8 months since we left Sony and started our own company. I have been really driving the creative side. We did a game for Sony Pictures to help promote one of their movies, and I'm working with a couple projects, some that are ours and some that we're doing work for hire, for the Gear VR and for the Oculus CV1. And I can't wait to show it to you guys.
All right, Patrick.
So I head up games for Skydance Media, which some of you may know the films that we create, like Mission Impossible and Star Trek and Terminator. My specific role is to help figure out how to take that caliber of adrenaline-laced entertainment and bring it into a headset, presence, virtual reality space. The first project that I've ever created in virtual reality was for the movie Interstellar, where we put people on, right outside of Saturn on a spaceship, super, super high fidelity, Oculus setup, toured it around the country, and really got to see for the first time what just casual consumers would do with virtual reality, how they would react in it. And it's unbelievably inspiring to see what happens when you're actually seeing like real users go into this headset in a completely different space for the first time. When I think about the question of like, what makes me get up in the morning about especially virtual reality, it's everything that we're doing is inventing something. For example, even on Interstellar, this was done about a year ago, and it was still when Oculus had rules around not moving the camera. And I'm sure those of you who have been with Oculus and have seen the transition of what we're allowed to do and who we're allowed to show it to, not moving the camera is kind of a big restriction. And we are literally rewriting the rule book every single day that we're making a new feature. And that, to me, is so exciting. And it's great to be part of a community, because right now, like, we're in that fledgling space where everybody is sharing everything that they're doing way before anything is released. And I think it's really just one of the most exciting times to be involved with the tech.
Awesome. So you can see we have a lot of experience and a lot of passion here on the panel. So now let's start with one of the most basic, but maybe also most difficult questions, which is when to use VR. You know how sometimes when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail? With this amazing VR technology, we want to use it for everything. But is it the right thing to use for every type of experience? So let's hear from the panel here. Patrick, you want to get started?
Yeah, so I think there are definitely types of games that VR doesn't make sense for. So VR isn't going. Some people I know are worried that VR is going to take over everything. If you go into Starbucks and you want to play a game for 10 seconds whilst you're waiting for your latte, you're always going to want a mobile game like Clash of Clans or something. That kind of snackable game, the games that you play on the move, that's never going to be replaced by VR. But I think what VR does so well is anything that teleports you to another world, anything that wants to make the player feel emotions. And I think rich, powerful, longer than a few minutes experiences are what VR is so good at. So I think that, broadly speaking, anything that's light and snackable and mobile and portable isn't right for VR. And anything that's deep and rich and meaningful and emotional is what VR was made for.
Greg?
It's interesting. Having been in the business for a long time, we've seen a lot of evolution, right? When I first got in the business, cartridges were being plugged into the home consoles, and then we had CD-ROMs and all the memory that unlocked for us. And then 3D came along, and finally, high bandwidth connections that can allow people to play together. And all those things felt very seminal at the time, and that they were going to be game-changing. But at least in my experience, this is the biggest reset we've seen in the interactive entertainment business, period. There's more new here than there is relevant to what we had learned and had done before. And I think, and this is maybe more true of investors than anybody, but oftentimes we seem to go into the future kind of walking backwards. So we're looking at what used to work and assuming that it's going to work instead of trying to figure out what this new paradigm actually unlocks and what the technology is actually capable of. So, coming back into this space here the last few months and meeting with a lot of entrepreneurs and seeing a lot of demos, it reminded me of those early days of the CD-ROM business, where it seemed like anybody that had content that they thought they could stick on a shiny disk had a relevant product to sell at retail. So I was at another conference that I won't name about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and there was a demo room with maybe 2 or 3 dozen entrepreneurs showing off, and one were these very likable 2 entrepreneurs that had a stand that said Yoga VR. And I said, Yoga VR? And my wife's a yoga instructor, so I had maybe a little bit of a reason to have something to connect back to her. So I put on the Oculus headset, and there I was on the Marina Green in San Francisco, staring out at the Golden Gate Bridge, and I had this beautiful yoga instructor ahead of me in very quiet tones. I was on my yoga mat, and the first thing I was supposed to go do is downward dog. And I'm thinking, I'm wearing a 3-pound computer on my head. The last thing I'm going to do is downward dog. So I guess that's a long way of saying that I think that because of the hype and the excitement, we're going to see a lot of people not understand how game-changing VR is, and that most of the ideas, unfortunately, that I've seen over the last few months have been ones that had a lot more resonance in the old world than they did in the new one that all of you are hopefully going to create.
It's interesting because for me, what works in VR, we were just talking about, like Spencer and I worked at Sony Pictures at one point. We were in some meetings together. And Patrick and I, we worked in a platform inside of PlayStation, which was a PlayStation Home. And we were looking around like what works in VR. And I feel like a lot of the things that I did for like recreating fan-based experience, like Ghostbusters Firehouse, you can go in there and you can pretend to be a Ghostbusters. I feel like VR has the capability to deliver everything that the fans want. So I feel like if you can bring the users to be fully immersed in VR, and by me, what I mean is be able to have not just the head-mounted display, but you have the eye tracking in there, and you have other ways to be in the space for real. It's just going to really deliver the dream what everybody wants. And Star Wars, I'm looking for an experience to come that way, to fulfill all of our dreams.
Now, Spencer, you have a different take on this, right?
Yeah, well, kind of. I mean, we were asking if we have any like controversial topics here, and I think we're all kind of generally in agreement. But I look at this from an evangelism perspective. Like 2016 is going to be an awesome year for everybody making contents. Fingers crossed. Early adopters will buy everything. That's great. My problem is I've seen some very, very good VR, and I've seen a lot more, pieces that don't need to be in VR. And I think that's a great place to start, right? We all have to start with a white piece of paper because there's no rote answer for what's a great VR experience right now. I think it's really critical, though, that as we're pushing into this new space, that we're, get something on screen and then really ask yourself, is this really going to make whoever's looking at it tell somebody else, oh my God, VR is so much better than playing, on your Xbox, on your TV. So right now I'm using this measure of, can you get somebody who's looking at your VR experience to become an evangelist for VR? Because I think that's what the 2017 part of our industry looks like. It's like, if we can convert every early adopter into an evangelist because what they see is so great they have to sell somebody else. Now, to the question of, how do you measure what's great in VR? It's like, there's all sorts of tricks of like, how do you make, the audio really trigger a surround experience? How do you really emphasize that somebody is present in a space? It's one thing, we've played first-person shooters for 20 years, but it's a whole other thing actually being in the space, and what's going to make it feel more special to be in a VR space than just a normal first-person shooter. Some of that's going to involve touching the space. Some of it is going to involve, audio and visual cues for things coming out of your peripheral vision. But I think it's still that, experiment. Start with something that's easy, and then keep pushing for, to be able to answer that question to create the evangelists.
Cool. So now that we've kind of looked at where to use VR versus not, let's dig deeper. And here we'd like to look at 3 different aspects of interaction. The first one is the technical aspect. So how do you input your command to the computer? How do you actually tell it what to do? 2 is going to be more on how to interact with the story, with the characters. And 3 is more about how interacting with other people in the VR world or environment. So let's start with the first one. We're basically getting into a world where there's no keyboard and mouse, and the traditional game controllers are becoming awkward. And we're looking for a new, more natural way to interact with the world that we're immersed in. So what are some of the best ways that we've seen so far? What are the more mature ones? What are the ones that you think could actually take over in the future? And obviously, there's no one answer. I think we all agree that it's going to be a combination, and it's going to depend on the use case that you're using it for. But I'd like to hear from you guys, from your experience. What are the kind of input devices? Is it the controllers, the touch? We've seen some gaze tracking interactions, obviously body movement, even more esoteric things like the Mayo armband. Have you guys seen Mayo armband, which can actually track your muscle movement? Or rings as a mean to interact in a more natural way. So what are you guys thinking?
One of the things that struck me, I remember getting the original Oculus demo maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, and thinking, wow, this is amazing. The promise of this is incredible. But it felt wrong. The tracking wasn't great at the time. The way they were building the software and forcing you to move made me at least sick. And it made me realize the threshold for getting it right, because the immersion is so incredible and so deep and locks out the rest of the world in such a fundamental way to your body and your mind, you got to get it right. And so one of the things I've really been impressed with are people that are fooling around with haptics. So if you've got a controller in the VR space and you're moving your hand, it's great to see your hand, and it's great to know that you can move and interact with things. But when my brain is telling me, wait, I just picked up a block, but I can't feel it, or it doesn't weigh anything, or when I throw it, I get no feedback, I immediately kind of leave the value of the immersion and the presence that I had in the headset. So I've seen a couple companies working on things that really give you the sense that the objects in the world that you're touching, moving, and interacting with are actually real. And that reinforces my sense that I've been transported to someplace amazing. So really love to see where that evolves to over the next couple of years, and how Facebook and Valve and HTC and Survios and some of the other guys integrate that into their offerings.
I think the most obvious way to control VR is with your hands. When people put a headset on for the very first time, almost without exception, they will reach out to try and touch what they're seeing. Everybody does that. Everybody I've seen using VR. So hand controllers or tracking your hands is the most obvious way, and I think that will be the standard for VR. We're already seeing that with the Oculus Touch, with the Move controllers on PlayStation, with the Vive controllers. It's obviously more of an issue, but I think mobile VR will ultimately, in a few years' time, get to that point where they do hand tracking using a camera as well, because it's the most obvious way to interact and the most comfortable and natural and intuitive way. One of the challenges we've got at the moment is that we want our games that launch this coming year to support all of the headsets. And so there are some very, very cool peripherals which are amazing, but are only going to sell in small numbers. And we can't afford to get our game working with absolutely everything. So we have to support controllers as well as touch, which is a pain, because we wish all the headsets only had touch control. It would be a dream. And I think it will move there. But for me, that's the exciting thing, moving your hands around.
Yeah, I feel like that's also, it really depends on the platforms, because you have layers of interaction. I really like the PlayStation Move too. I feel like it gives you your hands and has vibration, and you can really feel like you're picking up. You don't have the weight of the things, but it's very, it works. It's really nice. And when we started developing for the Gear VR, which has a touchpad, we had to solve the same problem that you had. It was like locomotion, how you move the user through the space. And we went through a lot of design discussions and deciding that the controller wasn't really the right way. And of course, we were finding a lot of things that made people nauseated, and we were trying different approaches. So actually, the demo that I have, it's you use the gesture movement to go forward or back, and then after you move forward and you hold, it just keeps you with that kind of speed of what you did, your gesture, and you keep walking on space. And because you're actually rotating based on where you're looking at, that's very natural. Like, I wouldn't go that way, but just like trying to slide that way. I would look that way, and then I will move forward. So I have showed that demo to a lot of people, and especially like standing up here in the conference too, and no one got sick so far. So it's good to see that you can't go around the limitations on the platform. You really have to think that way, because a lot of the users that will have a Gear VR, they would not have the controller. So you need to figure out how your experience is going to work that way. Same thing for PlayStation. Maybe not all the users will have a PlayStation Move, but if they do, you can get a much better experience. So I feel like from an out-of-the-box experience, the input that I like the most is the Valve, assuming that it comes with the controllers, right, as part of the box, which I hope all of the other platforms will also at least have a SKU or an option that you buy with that, because as I said before, like if you don't have your hands in VR, a lot of people will be doing this and they will try to use the controller, and it's going to lose a lot just by not having that input.
I find that it's such a tricky question, right? Because we know that if we want to sell a lot of units, you have to hit like a mobile platform, because there's not going to be as many touch controllers. Even Oculus is shipping with the game controller and not their fantastic kind of hand representations. touch is such a great one, and I know that we can kind of deep dive into like the different versions of like, you know, the Samsung Gear kind of experience, which I think, you know, your demo is really exceptional. But I'm very curious from the panel's perspective. So you build something that's got touch controllers. Your hands are there. It's awesome. Everything's awesome. The thing that I find with it's a similar thing of moving from a game controller to a touchpad. There's so many more things that your fingers can like glide over very, very quickly on a touchpad than you can with a game controller, which is like, you know, laboriously, you know, angle your orientation and your cursor and tap on something. When you get touch controllers in VR, how many things do you need to interact with that are outside of the main storyline just to make it feel like it's an immersive space? Because I know it's like, you know, kid in a candy store or like walking through, you know, any kind of like tchotchke shop, you know, you kind of want to touch everything. You know, is there a satisfaction level that we're going to be held accountable to actually make many more things touchable?
That's a good question.
For me, yes, because I was just thinking on the things that I had loved from building it. And imagine, just want to use this example because a lot of people know the movie. So imagine that you are in the Ghostbusters firehouse, right? And if you wanted to go to the ghost containment unit to make it work, you would instantaneously just go and touch it. If you want to go inside the Actor 1 and turn on the car, you know how to do it. You just instinctively you can just open the door and get inside and do those experiences.
Yeah, so you'd build the entire alive
yes,
environment.
Yes,
yeah.
but from a game development perspective, like all of those things, they already are capable to do. You're just going to spend the time in building it and refining it. I can see a table with a lot of objects that are just like physics-based, and people can pick it up, and they can look, and they can open the book and look around. That just means that we need to do it the right way.
It's interesting. I think anytime you increase the palette that you're going to give creative teams, you create opportunities, but you also create problems. And you know, to your question, Spencer, it's obviously once I'm fully immersed, I have an expectation that I can interact with everything. Unlike the controller, where I know I can scope rifle, reload, you know, change weapons. There's about 6 or 7 things I know I can do. Once I've got those controllers in my hand, I feel like anything I can do in the real world, I should be able to do in this world. And therefore, the threshold is very high for developers. But that doesn't always mean you're going to create a great entertainment experience. Sometimes limiting the input you're going to give somebody, even in an immersed environment, may end up delivering something that's a lot more impactful. So I think there are more questions than answers here, but I think it is a really interesting opportunity to experiment. And I think there is a challenge for those of you guys that are building games in VR to whether you design your games around the limitations of a controller or you take the big plunge to making the entire space that the user sees completely interactive.
Yeah. So I'd like to interject a question from the audience on this. Does anybody have a controversial or interesting question on interaction input devices? Yeah, go ahead.
So I think to your point earlier, what we've dealt with in the past is abstraction and interface when you press a button or pull a lever. And every evolution of interface since punch card computing has reduced that abstraction. And that's why I think touch devices like the iPad, for example, is just instantly intuitive to a child, whereas even a gamepad, like, my God, trying to get a loved one to play games with you is like the most painful thing ever, but give them a Wiimote, and suddenly it's like, oh, grandma can play tennis too, hooray, so it's, I think, to me, I think it's a combination of making the interfaces accessible. That's why VR holds such a magical opportunity, is because interface is just like, anybody can use it now. It's accessible. It isn't like this, this abstraction. And I think the other side of it is why it goes to saying that, I come from the cinematic side, so I think we're really struggling with that interactive element. It's never been native to our medium, but games are interactive from their DNA upwards, and that's why game engines hold so much potential. And all you have to do is apply collision to stuff and just wave your hand around, and voila, interactive world. I mean, the art's already there. You just have to add a simple layer of collision detection on top of it, and you get a lot of freebies. Yep. So I don't think that it's a question of if or whether you have to do it. I think the question is, yes, of course you should, but you have to also keep scale, scope in mind, and I think the real challenge that I see is that if you try to sort of dumb it down at the beginning, you're not really giving people an optimum experience, but at the same time the market's not ready to embrace it. So maybe the trade-off is that you can create some scalability with, like, well, here's the gamepad version, and we tried to compensate for that, but it's very easy to just simply flip a switch and voila, the game controllers are much more natural, and it'll allow you to do both.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, because if you think from a platform perspective, when you're developing or designing for the cardboard, it's really good for movie watching in 360, but you can't really interact with anything. So after a few minutes, I got frustrated because I'm like, okay, I want to go that way, or I want to interact with this, and I can't. Not to say that it's not great for, like, from a documentary perspective, that you can't tell a really nice story and make people immersive. But what I feel like, if we're talking about on a general platform perspective, I feel like the users that would try VR for the first time, they should try with the Oculus Touch, right? I feel like they should have the PlayStation Move. It's going to be much more accessible for anyone to pick it up and be able to play. And it's going to make the person who is demo is trying to sell that to be more acceptable as the fool guy in the house with the whole thing, and then everybody goes, oh, what is he doing? When they do it, it's going to make a lot of sense. But if they try to do it with gamepad, well, grandma and mom, they will not be able to do it because, like, I don't understand how that works. So I feel like for the developing of VR, it would be much better if more of the discount-based, like good sale price for the controllers to be packed with the device.
You can also do a lot more with the controllers. So rather than just thinking, look, I'm just going to grab stuff and throw it and pick it up, which is pretty cool in VR. I mean, you can juggle things with the Vive controllers or the Oculus Touch controllers, and it works brilliantly. But a good example is if you've seen London Heist on the PlayStation VR, they have a fantastic reloading mechanism using two Move controllers. So you pick up the bullets in one hand, and you have to sort of slide it in. And it's probably about 1 million times easier than it would be to reload in real life. If most people try to reload a gun, you'd probably struggle. But actually, as long as you get it remotely close and remotely the right direction, it'll automatically insert the ammo, and it works brilliantly well. And it's a nice combination of the two controllers, putting them together, and you feel like you're loading a gun, and you feel like you're there, and it works really well. So I think you can pick interactions. That level, that game doesn't need lots of things around to knock over and touch and stroke because it's got the gun and the bullets, and it just feels so cool. So I think you can be quite smart about it.
Awesome. Okay, let's switch to maybe the heart of interaction. And that is, how do you interact with the story, with the characters? How do you develop your storytelling techniques? And to that, let's start actually with Spencer at this point. Spencer, what do you think should be our lofty goals here? What should we aim for in reinventing this whole new kind of interaction?
I think it all comes down to thinking through this point of presence, right? Where for the first time we are in the space, we are immersed in the space, and I think we've all seen, some, actually in the recent years, some really good examples of AI characters, starting to respond to you in like a first-person kind of game. I think there's a new level of seeing those characters actually responding to you as if you were in the environment. The fact that you can look over your shoulder is an easy thing to say. The person that is, facing you should probably follow your gaze, just like they might do in real world. I think, when it comes to making the characters believable, there's easy things like, you want to feel like you walked into a room and they're not just waiting for you, that they actually have a life of their own in that room. Who knows what they're doing? They're shopkeepers or whatever. They're busy stocking shelf. You come in the room and they actually turn and respond to you wherever you might be standing in the room, and as you're pointing to things or looking at things, they're following along with those same clues. So they almost become a tool to help emphasize your presence in the space. You can almost think of it as a very simple, trick to help people further feel that they're there.
Yeah. I feel like it's really exciting. There's a lot of things that you can do, especially coming from the game side. I remember seeing all the cool demos that a character responds to you and talks to you, and then you start like looking around, because that's what a lot of people do in VR, right? So like, hey, look at me. And it was just like, well, then you kind of like get quiet. And at the same time, playing some of the horror games, and when you see like a ghost coming to you, it's just like so interesting and immersive. It's like, okay, yeah. I even feel like there should be a different rating board for horror games, because I feel like when you see a ghost in a regular screen, it's okay. But when you see a ghost in real life, my perceptual system freaks out. And I feel like, okay, this is awesome, but we need to understand how to use it. But I feel like the potential to do those things, especially coming from the game side, are just fantastic.
Which is great for immersion, right? I mean, just the fact that the ghost can come and take over your field of view, and but I want the ghost to like wherever I'm looking, I want it to kind of twist around and confront me, like a ghost can do.
There are some games that you're just like passing by, and then you notice something moving on the wall, and then when you look, there's, that's that poster, there's that person on the picture that's looking at you. And as you're moving, their eyes follow you, and then you just freak out. So there's a lot of things that you can play in this space.
I can remember, I must have been 11 or 12 years old when the first Star Wars movie came out. Changed my life. I walked out of the theater, and the first thing I thought about wasn't, when's the next movie coming out? It's, how do I get there? How can I hang out with Luke and Han? How can I live in that universe and actually be there? And so, throughout my career in the games business, that's been a constant theme of trying to not just build games based on IPs, but actually create the world. So people feel like they're actually living in the world that they fell in love with, and they have agency there, and the things they do actually matters. And it's one of the big reasons we invested in BioWare, because they kind of took that storytelling and role-playing games to a different level. And I think the opportunity with VR is to kind of complete that dream I had when I was 12. So this summer, I learned about a company, and some of you may have heard of it, a UK-based company called Secret Cinema. And one of the things they do is they take and rebuild motion picture studios of famous IP. So this summer, they rebuilt one based on Empire Strikes Back. So it's like a 4 square acre area, set at night. You pay a ticket and you come in, and instead of it being a theme park or a ride, you're actually inside the Empire Strikes Back. And it's populated with actors and also fellow ticket goers with you, and you have a role, you put on the costume, and you enter the universe. You leave who you were behind, and now you're on an adventure trying to solve problems. Incredible experience, very popular, very successful company. We can do that in VR, and we can do it on steroids, to the example that Spencer gave, where I'm actually hanging out with Luke Skywalker, and he actually cares what I do and think and reacts to me much as I could imagine he would in the real world. And I know that's not tomorrow or 2016, but that's where we need to go with storytelling, and that's what this medium is going to give us an opportunity to deliver.
And Greg, if you go into this Secret Cinema VR style, then you solve some of the problems of the interactivity, because it's a social experience and everybody's there playing a role, so there's no expectation that someone is not going to react if you get there.
That's exactly right. I don't have to fly to London, and I can bring my friends.
Believe me, I was trying to go to the Back to the Future one so bad, and I couldn't get there. So if there was a VR experience, believe me, $60, just take my money out.
We've got so much potential for storytelling in VR. That's a great thing. VR is an emotion amplifier. If you tried horror games in VR, you know what? They are 10 times scarier than a horror game on a screen, because rather than spectating through a big square window, you're inside it, and it's not just horror, it's also excitement and fear and all sorts of other things, love and respect and amazement and all these other great emotions that are much, much, much more powerful in VR, and that is fantastic from a storytelling point of view. So I think we're only just scratching the surface. There is so much we can do. When you have a character come up to you and look you in the eyes and hand over and reach out and give you something, or telling stories, you can't do it through cutscenes like traditional games have done. You kind of have to tell the story as you're moving through it. But you can use things like environmental storytelling, because people in VR are so much more keen to look around and examine stuff, and they notice things much more because you feel like you're there. You can use the environment to tell stories, to have a bloody footprint on the floor, or things happening, and direct your gaze, and you can do some really nice tricks. So I cannot wait to see how storytelling evolves in VR because of that emotional amplification. It's going to be so exciting.
Yeah, and a challenge to everybody too. I mentioned the kind of going into the future, walking backwards earlier. Let's not fall in the trap of things that didn't work in the past, like the branching stories that we all read when we were like 8 years old and they came and they went. I mean, that is way too limiting for this palette. Let's think bigger than that as we approach storytelling in VR, please.
I have a quick follow-up question for Patrick. We're seeing some challenges in terms of developing user experiences for mobile VR versus high-end VR. So from your experience, what are kind of the different approaches that you took to tell a story in those two types of platforms?
So it's certainly a challenge. At the moment, we're creating separate products for high-end and mobile, just because there's such a difference in terms of the fidelity possible graphically, but also the fact that you don't have positional tracking currently on mobile. And that's a real issue if you want to do exploring game where you want to look at characters, without having that positional movement, it's a bit of a barrier. So at the moment for us, telling great stories is so much easier in the high end because you can do it really well. Having a good looking character that comes up to you on a Gear VR, for example, is a struggle because you've only got so many draw calls, and actually technically it's quite an issue. So I don't know. From our point of view, the only experience we've got of proper storytelling, to be honest with you, is at the high end. We haven't attempted it yet on mobile VR. I think we would try and make a bespoke adventure game or a bespoke story for Gear VR that was designed around the limitations and didn't have you doing free movement, but actually had that story kind of happening around you. But I think you'll see in the next few years positional tracking coming in and the mobile phone technology getting better and better and better as it is so rapidly that actually that gap is going to narrow really, really quickly.
So quick question from the audience on this. Yeah, go ahead.
You're talking about limitations of Gear VR positional tracking. Head tracking, I think, is underexplored. I saw this demo where a guy was using tilting your head to the right to move forward and tilting your head to the left to move back. I wonder if you guys have experimented with using head tilt even more in terms of moving around.
So the question is about using head tracking as a way to interact with the story.
So we've used head tracking not to move around because we find that if people have to do the same head movements repeatedly, it can be quite uncomfortable after sort of more than 10 or 15 minutes. But we use it to delight the player. So for example, you can open a locker and there's some mugs in there. And if you actually lean in and look in, you'll notice there's a little spider in one of the mugs. And you wouldn't know that otherwise. And if you're on a traditional console game, you'd never see that. But because in VR, you can look in, you notice little details. Or you can look under tables and find a little hidden secret note that people have left there. And you go, oh yeah, I've discovered that. Little kind of Easter eggs that are hidden around. And I think that's a really nice way to use the fact that you can look behind things.
Yeah, that sounds a very interesting idea, but the challenge that you have if you try to look down to move forward or to look up to go back is that when you want to actually interact with some objects, so imagine that there's a poster or there's like a TV or something that you want to interact with, right? You just naturally want to look there, and then you kind of like trying to be balancing like where you are. So we did a lot of experimentation. One of the first ideas was exactly that. I looks down and then I go forward, and quickly we saw it's very limiting on what you want to do. What we ended up doing was putting the rotation we use the head tracking just to define the rotation, and then in the Gear VR you use the gesture to move forward and back. And if you have a controller, actually don't use the right stick to rotate unless come with a suggestion that Patrick has, that use the triggers or use something that quickly moves around, because moving it fast, unless it's like instantaneously cut, it works. But if you move too fast, people got nauseated. And if you move too slow, people go like, what's going on? And then they start feeling more sick about it.
So we're now switching to the third aspect of interaction, and that is interacting with other people. Social VR for some people may sound like an oxymoron because VR is more of a solitary experience, but in fact we know it's not true. So I'd like to ask the panel for some of the most compelling examples you've seen for interacting between people in a VR world.
For me, it was no doubt about it. The best demo that I saw socially in VR was the Oculus toy box. Yeah. That when someone said hey, hi, and I had the controllers in my hand, but I never used, and then I instantaneously just said hi, and it's like, hey, let's just train you. Can you point here? And then I was like, okay. It was super impressive. Like we were putting blocks on top of each other, and that was a lot of fun. And we were like playing ping pong, and it was insanely cool. Like just get the ball, put it on top of the racket, and then you can bounce, and then you can start playing. Like to me, doing that with another person. And especially like me and Patrick, we worked on a social network on PlayStation, which was the PlayStation Home. It was totally social. So you can imagine how those experiences will take VR to the next level. Because if you're just doing things by yourself, there's a game, there's a narrative, it's cool. But the moment that you have someone else, anyone that would get stuck in a part of the game, there's someone else there to help you. And that's going to be really cool.
Not to be too much of a Toy Box fanboy, but I think there's the other part of Toy Box that was amazing for me, and this is kind of a general note. It's not just that you're interacting, you are like fantasy wish fulfillment. It's like, and I think this is a really critical differentiator that VR has the opportunity to do. Because you are present, you are kind of yourself, but in a different place. You've transported to some other world. And you get to possibly do things, with the features that we build that make it so you can do impossible things and then experience the results of those impossible things. Like, and Toybox has several of those, from like shooting fireworks at your friend, which is stupid and awesome.
Shrinking.
The shrink gun is fantastic. Suddenly you're tiny and your voice is pitched. They didn't just make you tiny, which is a fantastic perspective change and super, super fun. They changed the pitch of your voice and the microphone. So they went through and they kind of use all of the little tools that they've got with, I don't know how many of you have seen Toybox, but it's an incredibly lo-fi experience. Yet it's a great example that it's not necessarily about fidelity that's going to make this engaging. It's going to be, at least for me, it's this wish fulfillment and being able to do something completely different. Bonus is that I'm doing it with somebody else.
There's so much things that you communicate, not just by your voice, but the way you move your head, the way you move your hands. When I met the guy who was giving me the training after, I was just like, oh, okay. It was to me like, it's amazing.
It's I think social is an imperative. It's not an opportunity. I think it's an imperative. If you want to look at the step function growth of video games, interactive entertainment, it's driven by social, right? So the old 16-bit systems, when we could play 2, 3, 4 of us playing NHL hockey, the business went up. All of a sudden, there was local area networks. Doom came around. The business got bigger. As soon as we got to broadband and we had giant MMOs, World of Warcraft came out, the business got bigger. People interact and they want to get immersed, not to get away from other people, but as a way of connecting. And there's never been a better platform for allowing people to connect than what VR is going to allow. So, and it doesn't have to just be Toybox, because I loved it as well, and I think that was the best one. But that's a difficult one technically to make work over long distances because of latency. But just to have the notion that I can go on a trip with my sister who lives on the East Coast, we can go to Rome together in our VR headsets, we can be there and experiencing it, talking to each other. It goes far beyond, a chat functionality. We're actually there together, and that's a really powerful thing.
And I'll just say a quick note for asynchronous gameplay. So on the PlayStation and on the Oculus, you can actually have people playing locally who don't have a headset on with the guy who has the headset on. So on the PlayStation VR, for example, you have a couple of people on the controller with something different on the screen, and the PlayStation VR, the guy in there seeing some part of the same game, and they could be throwing hazards in and seeing what he's doing, and you can get some fantastic local kind of social experiences in that as well. So it doesn't have to be online. I'm a huge believer in the whole snow crash virtual world, and I think there'll be a VR virtual world that will come over the next few years. It's going to be incredible, but you can also do some great stuff in the living room.
So we're running out of time. I still want to leave a couple minutes for questions. But we want to talk about the future and some of the things that you have on your wish list. So literally one word from each one of you about what you would like to see next in terms of VR interaction.
Cordless.
Eye tracking.
I want to see the Magic Leap demo, the $10 billion demo.
I want to see an AR/VR combined headset.
Okay, that was it. So now questions from the audience. Go ahead.
Since we're talking about VR today and then also into the future, we were talking about characters. Nobody mentioned voice. Is there a future for actual voice interaction with characters in the future? And how might that work?
So question is about voice interaction.
Yeah, I think that for me, the dream AI scenario is that you're chatting to a character and he's talking back with computer-generated voice on the fly, so he can say new things depending on what's happened in the game. And I think that will be fantastic. With the advent of cloud computing and IBM's Watson and all this other clever stuff, there is the potential to do proper speech tracking like Siri does, and to understand what you're saying and to actually have that as an input into the game. I would love to do an adventure game that was voice-powered, and I think you may see. I don't think you'll see them happen this year or next year, but I think maybe a few years' time you'll see that start to come in.
And look, we have Amazon Echoes in our house, right? We got Siri's sitting there, so the technology isn't that far away to enable that.
Questions? Yeah, go ahead.
But the question is, just as you do transition from cinema into VR, actually, Spencer, this is for you too. Cinema into VR, what will
Yeah, I mean, I love the vision, right? That you fewer barriers to entry, please. But web browsers, man, oh man, I mean, we're doing a heavy 3D HTML5 project right now. Web browsers are just not equipped. I mean, this is going back to Google and Apple. I mean, Firefox. I mean, that stuff needs to get light years better at using the hardware. I mean, it is amazing. Just dealing with common texture problems. I mean, you're talking about simultaneity of experience, and potentially multiplayer. It's like I'm struggling with pretty minimal draw screens that are sub-mobile quality and just struggling. It's, I mean, yeah, if Unity was installed with every web browser, it'd be easy. And if you're willing to, choke on that, great. But if you're actually going for an HTML5 experience, the industry, the browser industry needs to step up.
WebGL? That's the hope. Look, I think that one of the interesting things you get out of the constraints potentially with the opportunity is user-generated content gets a lot easier in a web delivered, and that can make up for some of the lack of fidelity and some of the technology limitations in the way that other people want to tell their story and have you come join it. But it's some tough problems to solve.
Yeah.
All right, folks, we have to wrap up.
Okay.
We're out of time. So join me in thanking again our amazing panel here with Spencer, Danilo, Greg, and Patrick.